After recently finding what we've been calling a mega trap Kohler toilet from the 60s, 70s era, and discovering that I actually found two of them, and they were both branded Corwin on the bottom, I decided to go back to my late 60s and 1972 Kohler catalogs and look at the cross sections of the Corwin and Kingston toilets. And I think it makes sense with what I found. So I'm going to try to start in chronological order, start in the 60s. The new style Kingston came out in late 1965. The Corwin came out in late 1966. And as such, at that time, the toilets looked like this. Now, note, it says Corwin, it says quiet action, 3-inch passageway. Kingston, 2 5/8 inch passageway. You can see a cross section. And just a second here. Okay, here is the 1972 catalog. Note the Corwin and the Kingston. Also notice how the Corwin, it doesn't, in 1972, it doesn't note quiet action anymore. I find that interesting. But anyway, here are the cross sections from the 1970s Corwin and Kingston. They are more or less identical. But note, both of these toilets from the 70s have a siphon jet that is clearly fed from the front of the bowl. So the water comes in the spud, goes around the rim, feeds down to the jet. The only difference that I can find seems to be that the Corwins in the 70s simply had a 3-inch passageway. So anyway, back to the 60s. These are the 60s cross sections. Notice how the 60s Corwin and Kingston, the siphon jet opens up into this cavity which kind of disappears. That's because on these toilets prior to 1970 or 71, the water on both the Corwin and the Kingston, the water came in the spud opening and passed through some side jet channels, one on each side of the toilet, that came down the side and fed this cavity right here, and fed the siphon jet. So if you were to look on one of those toilets, this is a 70s model by the way, you would see a channel coming down the side and ending right there. What I just described and what you see in these cross sections is what we had previously been calling the Kohler Corwyn throughout the run of it, throughout its entire run. And I have found two of those toilets, which I videoed in video number 73 on my channel. That was a few years ago. But according to both of these cross sections, and I'm tempted to believe it now, I didn't believe it for a time, it appears that during the late 60s, Kohler made both the Corwin and the Kingston in that exact same style, with the more circular looking trapway that looks kind of like that, and a little bump on the siphon jet and a smaller siphon jet. Apparently they were both made that way, with the only difference being the Corwin had an inner trapway bore of 3 inches, and the Kingston had an inner bore of 2 5/8. So that's only a difference of 3/8 of, well, that doesn't mean much. About 3/8 of an inch, like probably about a little bit thicker than this pen. So it's hard to tell. The problem with that, the problem with that is, in all of the toilets of this style that we've seen on YouTube, I've never noticed any major differences in the look of the trapway shape. So it could be very hard to tell just by looking at the trapway shape the difference between a late 60s Kingston and a late 60s Corwin. There is a difference, and it's in the trapway size. It kind of seems that they designed both toilets to look the same on the outside, only one flushes quieter than the other and one has a bigger trap. But I have also noticed the Corwin has a water table area. The late 60s Corwin has a water table area of 12 inches wide by 12 3/4 inches long. And the Kingston has a water table area of 12 1/4 inches wide by 14 inches long, so it's a little bit bigger water table. So I suppose the only way to be sure that I know of, if you find one of these late 60s Kohler toilets, the only way that I would know of to tell whether it's a Kingston or a Corwin would be either to look on the bottom at the stamp, which is right there. Sometimes they don't show up, sometimes they never showed up. Or if you have a tape measure with you, measure the water table size. But I have also noticed a slight difference in the drawing inside, right there. See that? It's probably kind of representative of the channels to the rim. It's different on the Kingston. This is the Kingston over here on the right, and this is the Corwin over here on the left. There's a slight difference, and I think that probably, whatever difference that makes, it probably helps keep air during a flush, keep air from coming out of the rim on a Corwin, which makes it quieter, because that was what they did on the old Kenwyn toilets. That's the main reason why the Corwin was quieter in the 60s, and they marketed it, they sold it as such. And the Kingston didn't have that feature, so it was louder, and they didn't charge as much money for it. So that's another difference. That's, I don't know. The toilets that I found in video 73, I did notice they were not that loud. They seemed to be a little quieter than a lot of the 70s Kohler wall hungs that I've seen. So maybe they were Corwins, but I can't say without going back to look at them some more. So that's the late 60s. Enter 1972. The cross sections and the designs of both Corwin and Kingstons have changed to a toilet with, both toilets have a front-fed siphon jet that's fed from the front of the rim. The Corwin still has a 3-inch trapway. The Kingston still has a 2 5/8 inch trapway. And the water tables on these toilets are actually both the same, exactly the same. But notice, it doesn't say anything about quiet action on the Corwin anymore. And what I've personally noticed, I've now found 3 of the 70s, what we're now calling the 70s Corwins with the very large mega trapway. They seem to be just as loud as the other 70s Kingstons that I've found. So my guess is that they kind of watered down the selling points of the Corwin in the 70s for whatever reason, to where the only difference between the two toilets was literally the size of the trapway. The quiet feature was not even pursued or marketed anymore. The toilet that I recently filmed that said Corwin on the bottom had the very large tombstone shaped trapway, and it had a front fed jet. I can't say for certain, but I would have to assume that for the remainder of its run, as long as they made it, the Corwin was probably made in that style with the large tombstone trapway until they discontinued it, which I don't know when that was. Probably sometime in the 80s, but I've never seen a Kohler lineup from the 80s, so I can't say. So, from YouTube and also from seeing these toilets myself, I've noticed, I guess, 3 different trapway shapes from the 70s. Based on what I found, I'm going to call these largest ones Corwins. And there's still a couple other ones that I've noticed, which I think are Kingstons. They're smaller, but now it makes me want to find these toilets again and look under them for a stamp to see for sure. But this is kind of a more rounded trapway, like the one in my 1975 Kingston. It's a little bit more rounded on the top and little more rounded corners. And there's another style, which I still think is a Kingston, which has a trapway that's about the same size, but it's a little more clean cut on the corners and a little more of that nice clean cut tombstone shape. It's just not as big as that one. I've seen some of those as well, but I didn't film them when I saw them. If you want to see some Kingstons with this style trap, search on YouTube 1971 Kohler Kingston, and YouTube user Mopar Man has a couple of videos of some 1971 backspud Kingstons in a school with a trapway that I consider to be this style as I've drawn it. So I hope that makes sense. You know, I drew kind of just a little quick sketch here of a timeline. Your late 1960s, both Kingstons and Corwyns had a trapway that looked like that, kind of circular looking trapway with a small siphon jet. And it's really hard. There is a difference between them. The Corwin has a slightly larger trap and it's quieter, but it's hard to tell the difference, I guess, unless you find enough. Maybe you can identify the features. And then it looks like, based on my catalogs, about 1970 or 71, your Kingstons took on either one of those style traps, and your Corwin from the 70s adopted the largest tombstone shaped trap. And this probably continued sometime into the 80s. One last note, one possible reason, and I can't prove this, I don't know if it's true or not. One possible reason for having 2 different shapes of trapway on 1970s Kingstons, and I know both of these styles were made in the 70s. Kohler was making toilets in 2 different plants in the United States at that time. They made toilets in Kohler, Wisconsin. They also made them in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Now, my 1975 Kingston has what I consider to be this style, and it was made in Spartanburg, South Carolina. So it's very possible that they did things just a little bit different in the Wisconsin plant. Maybe they made that style trapway at the same time as these were being made in South Carolina. I can't prove that. I don't know if that's true. One reason I wonder that is because there are toilets from 1971, Kingston's, with this trapway. But I know of some Kingstons with this style trapway that are in a building that was built in 1977. And yet, my 1975 Kingston with this style trapway is in the middle of those somewhere. So that's why I think they could have come out of two different plants at the same time. But again, I can't prove that, so I'm not going to say that for fact. Well, that's a little confusing, but I hope it made sense. I wanted to throw that out there with the cross sections that are in my catalogs, because I think it kind of helps explain the difference, especially now finding that 70s Corwin. It makes sense with the 70s cross sections the way they are. And that's it.